name's Nathan Donnelly. I'm the greenhouse manager here at Ohio State ATI. A little bit of background on me. I would have graduated from Ohio State ATI with my Associates of Applied Science in Greenhouse Production and Management, and I would have spent 5 or 6 years out in industry. Most of that was spent at Tin Buck Farms in Granville, Ohio, where I would have mostly done vegetative propagation of annuals. Then I also spent 1.5 years up at Chef's Garden, growing edible flowers, culinary herbs, asparagus for the top chefs. Did service the top 1% of the population, and then back in 2016 I took the job as a greenhouse manager here. So we're currently standing in National House, which is housing our mums and poinsettias that are going to be for production for here for students to use next fall. And we're going to go through here and look through our new ranges, 150, 160, 170, and explain to you how those houses work and what we're using them for education purposes. So we're currently in G150, which we refer to as the blackout house. We refer to it as the blackout house because we have these blackout curtains in here. And what these allow me to do is they allow me to manipulate photo period to have artificial short days. So what that means is we've got poinsettias, right? They trigger their flower response naturally somewhere between September 15th and September 20th. So for education purposes, what we do is I'll take half those poinsettias that are in there, bring them into this house. I will tell this curtain to pull 2 hours before sunset and open 2 hours after sunrise, therefore artificially lengthening the night period by 4 hours, triggering these plants on September 1st to trigger their reproductive response, and we'll see these guys progress 2 weeks earlier than we see the ones that are in National House that go under the natural photo period. So, and all that's controlled through our environmental control computer, and like I said, I tell it that I want it to pull 2 hours before sunset, open 2 hours after sunrise. It does it all automatically, and
hey, we're good. Okay,
yes.
So what are we growing in this house now?
So what we have in this house now is a collection of our succulents and some house plants that are normally housed in our L&B houses. The reason I have them in here is because, and we'll go into more detail in your class time when we walk through, but as greenhouse structures progressed through history, they started off really short because back in the 60s and 70s, natural gas was really high. The thought process was we'll build these tiny structures so that we have less air that we have to heat, so therefore we save money on natural gas. Well, then in the mid-80s, 90s, natural gas prices went down, and then they realized that, hey, if you have a larger air volume, it's much more difficult, and it's much more difficult to change that temperature, but it's also easier to maintain that temperature, right? So those houses there that were built in the mid-70s are only about 8 feet to the gutter, and then when we're in here, we're 10 feet. So those houses are extremely, extremely hot. I actually get hot enough, I've gotten hot enough in here this summer to melt plastic, right? So if it's hot enough to melt plastic, it's gonna toast plants. So I had to move those plants that were in those houses over into here so that we just didn't fry and kill everything.
We're ready.
Okay, so we are now in G160, which we refer to as the propagation house. So earlier you guys heard me refer to myself that I was a vegetative propagator. What that means is that you take a vegetative cutting, so this is a poinsettia cutting, and you'll see that it has no roots on it. So we went through, we pinched that off of a plant, we take that and we stick it into soil. We mist it with our misters here, and then we go through, and on a poinsettia it's going to take us about 2-3 weeks, and as time goes through and progresses, they actually go through and you get new plants that go through and set roots. Then we'll take these out, we'll shift them up, and this will actually be for our 6-inch program. Like I said, poinsettias take between 3 to 4 weeks to go through and root out. I've done, for our program here, poinsettia-wise, we've done 4,000 pieces that were all donated by Newman Orange and Selecta. The nice thing about this mist in here is that I'm able to drive it on accumulated solar radiation. So what that means is the old way, or the typical way of going through and driving mist, is that I would tell it that I want it to run for 5 seconds every 15 minutes, right? But the old cliche in Ohio is if you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes and it'll change. With accumulated solar radiation, I can tell it that I want it to run every 1 mole of light that is accumulated from a weather station, and it'll go through, and once we've accumulated 1 mole, it'll run a mist event. So if it's sunny out, it'll go through and it'll run more mist events because it's accumulating that mole quicker. If it's cloudy, it'll accumulate it slower, therefore running fewer mist events, keeping me from having to come in and tell it to run in 20 minutes or in 10 minutes or in 30 minutes based on what the weather's doing outside. So it saves me a lot of time to be able to go through and interact with students versus monkey around in environmental controls all the time. We are now in G170, also referred to as the hydroponic house. So we go through and have many different forms of production to go through and simulate all the different forms of production for our students here. So here we've got our aeroponic towers. So what's inside here is there's a smaller cylinder with mist nozzles inside this larger cylinder, and we tell these that we want them to run for 5 minutes every 15 minutes, and it actually roots or mists the root zone in air and sprays their nutrient solution on them. So that differs from the NFTs, which are over here. NFT stands for nutrient film technique. And what we've got over here is we've got a reservoir that goes through and has a pH and EC corrected solution that runs a constant film through these channels that the roots sit in to go through and feed these plants. So the idea behind those is that you're able to, those being the aeroponic systems, is that they take advantage of cubic square footage, or cubic footage instead of just square footage. So you're able to get more plants in a house with aeroponics over NFT. Aeroponics is a very new technology. Not a lot of guys are doing it commercially. I think it has some promise with variety selection, because the same varieties that do well in here, we have seen do not necessarily do well in the aeroponic systems. Then as we go back here, we have got our simulated DWC. So DWC stands for deep water culture. So here in the NFTs, we literally have less than a quarter inch of water that's running through those channels constantly. In the DWC, we've got this, 16, 18 inch profile of water that is in here that the plants, the roots are suspended. So we go through, we put them in these little web cups, and then the roots go through and they just come down here in the water, and we've got aeration in here to help keep our DO up. So what we're doing here is we're comparing the growth in DWC to the growth in NFT. pHs are all the same, ECs are all the same, and we keep track of what the dissolved oxygen is in each of these tanks. We'll go through, we'll do fresh weights, dry weights, so on and so forth to see which one grow better. And then back here we just finished up some high wire crop research on cucumbers. We were going through and testing different medias. So what we do is the vine grows up this string. We go through, it hooks over the top, and then it grows back down to the ground for cucumbers. And then when we do tomatoes, we actually, when you guys are here in the fall, we'll actually have tomatoes growing, and you'll see that we actually lower the tomatoes and we continue to wrap them around, because in greenhouses, we use what are referred to as indeterminate variety tomatoes. The tomatoes that you grow in the garden are most likely determinate, which means they grow, they set flower, they get pollinated, and they're done for the season. Indeterminates continue to set new flower clusters off of new growth, which allows us to keep the tomato in the greenhouse for up to a year. And then some of the different environmental things we have in these houses. Above us, you'll see that we've got HID lights. These are high pressure sodiums. We use those to help stimulate growth in cloudy, winter, fall, nasty Ohio weather. And those are driven off the environmental control computer. I go through and I tell them that I want them to run from an hour before sunrise to 2 hours after sunset if light levels are below X, right? Because there's no reason to waste the electricity if I've got a nice bright sunny day, and the weather station takes that information, and if it's bright enough outside, it shuts the lights off automatically. And then over here behind us, we have our fan and fan cooling system. So many of you are probably familiar with poultry barns, where they go through and they have those big cellulose pads that sit on the wall, water cascades through them, the fan pulls through. These are the exact same thing. If you're not familiar how it works, is that there's a pump in this gray box here that goes through and pumps water up into a perforated tube that's over top of here. Water cascades down through these pads. The fans on that side pull air through here, forcing humidity into the air, bringing it into the zone, and then just like sweat on your skin, when that water evaporates out of the air, it takes heat with it, therefore actively cooling the zones. They work really, really well when it's hot and low humidity. They don't work well when it's hot and humid, because if you've got 90% humidity outside, you're bringing that outside air in. It's very difficult to force more humidity into that air already, and since we've got high humidity, there's nowhere for that water to go, and it just sits and it gets nasty. So a few weeks ago, we had 93-degree weather. I was actually 84 to 86 in these houses when it was 93 degrees outside. So what we've got going on here with this variety of mum is we're doing a pinch versus a no pinch. So what I did here on this plant is I went through and I pinched out its apical meristem, which is what causes the plant to grow up. And on these plants here, I left that meristematic tissue in place. So all mums that are now done, I guess I shouldn't say all the mums that I grow are grown for the purpose of no pinch. It's labor saving out in industry, because here I'm doing around 1,000 8-inch mums. Out in industry I would do around 60,000 8-inch mums, right? So if I had to pay somebody to pinch 60,000 mums, that would be a massive amount of labor. So through genetic selection, we've gotten these plants to be where you don't have to pinch them in order for them to finish. So to go through and demonstrate that to students here this fall, we've got these plants that are not pinched and these plants that are pinched. And since we pinched them before flower initiation, we shouldn't have any issues with flowering time differences or anything like that. And come the time these do finish, it is my belief that we are going to have a hard time dictating between what was pinched and what was not pinched, because these guys will start to branch out, these guys will continue to grow, and they'll basically look exactly the same once they finish.
And there will be no difference in flowering time in theory?
In theory, there should be no difference in flowering time.
Okay. And these are a product of artificial selection and not genetic engineering or bioengineering or anything like that?
Correct. So we've gone through, and so these are done from vegetative cuttings, right? So what that means is that there's a farm in California that has stock plants of all of these. They go through, they get cut off. So these are clones of plants that have been selected for their desirable traits, right? Their compactness, their free branching ability, so on and so forth. But there hasn't been taking the genome of this plant with the genome of this plant and blending it into one thing. The plant we want, it was take the pollen from this plant that we like the height of and put it to the, help me out here with the actual science.
Pistil.
The pistil of the, you put that in there, I'd be funny. With the pistil of the other plant, take those seeds, collect those, grow those out. Okay, we like this one best, we're going to propagate this one prolifically because that's the one we want to use for our stock plants to go through and send to our customers as our marketable one.
So is this a combination of hybridization and selection, or is it mostly hybridization?
Hybridization and selection.
Hybridization and selection.
So you've got the breeder who's going through and doing all sorts of crazy breeding, collecting the seeds, growing it out, evaluating it, and then taking the best of this one, the best of this one, going through breeding that together again, taking the best of the best. You know, you're probably, I don't know, several generations in before they get a plant that they say, okay, we're going to take this one to market and we're going to propagate that one. They're going to propagate it by tissue culture, so that they can virus index it, because they want to. You can't virus index vegetative cuttings, but you can virus index tissue culture. So they'll grow their stock plants from tissue culture and then make their stock plants from that, then take cuttings from those plants to send to